Picking up from our last discussion on Croce's philosophical defenses, we see a fascinating duality emerge when he turns his gaze to history. On one hand, in his theoretical works like The Aesthetics and Theory and History of Historiography, he lays out the histories of thought with an almost unshakable confidence. He draws clear lines between periods, defines the shifts, and explains the whole grand process. It's like he's got the map of intellectual territory perfectly charted. But then, bam! The final chapters always pivot back to his own philosophy of the spirit, presented as the ultimate source of wisdom for living. And what does this grand philosophy actually offer for navigating daily life? Just a very general, almost empty command: live somehow. It's like getting a detailed architectural blueprint for a house, but being told the only instruction for living there is to just live there. This brings us to the real kicker in his theory and history of historiography. Think about it. Croce spends ages dissecting all the historical debates of his time, the endless squabbles about how history relates to art, how to reconcile it with philosophy, how to bridge idealism and positivism. He paints a picture of a field riddled with contradictions. Then, in the grand finale, he drops the bomb. All these conflicts are resolved. How? By his new philosophy, naturally. This philosophy of the spirit he's been cooking up since the late 1890s is the magic key. The solution? Simple. All those seemingly opposed elements, history versus art, idealism versus positivism, they're not really opposed. They're just different facets, different moments of a single unified spirit. It sounds almost too neat, doesn't it? Like finding out your family feud was just because everyone was secretly part of the same secret society. It promises a unified comic conception of history, where all the messy bits fit together beautifully. So what is this mystical spirit? According to Croce, reality itself is this spirit. Not some ghostly thing floating above the world, but something that coincides with the world. Nature? It's just a moment, a product of this spirit. Boom. Gone goes the old mind over matter problem that plagued thinkers from Thales to Spencer. This spirit has it all, the attributes of physical nature and consciousness. It's this incredible paradox, both one and diverse, an eternal solution and an eternal problem. And the kicker: philosophy is its self-awareness, its history. History is its philosophy. They're fundamentally the same thing. This neat trick, this identification of opposites, supposedly comes from recognizing that consciousness is identical with self-consciousness, distinct yet one, like life and thought. It's like saying, look, your brain and your awareness of having a brain, they're two sides of the same coin, part of the same fundamental reality. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, and frankly, a bit frustrating. Croce saw this new understanding everywhere, in his own work, in folks like Meineke. He felt a wave of optimism, a belief in a new era of intellectual and cultural achievement, a truly superior historiography was dawning. But then, plot twist, he immediately throws a wrench into his own machinery. He declares it impossible to write the history of this very philosophy and historiography. Why? Because it's still happening. It's the style of an epoch that's just opening, not closed. We can't even draw its boundaries. We don't know how long it will last, which countries it'll encompass. And crucially, we can't logically assess its value beyond these limits because we're stuck inside it. We haven't even dropped anchor in port to figure out where the next voyage is taking us. It's like trying to write a definitive history of the internet while you're still actively using it, posting memes, and figuring out its next iteration. So, we're left with this bizarre situation. This new philosophy gives Croce and his contemporaries hope for a golden age of thought, a brand new way of doing history that's supposedly light years ahead of anything before. But simultaneously it handcuffs them. It forbids them from using this very new historical consciousness to analyze their own time. The very advancement of historical understanding is proven by the fact that it can't say anything meaningful about the present moment in which that understanding is achieved. It's like inventing a super powerful telescope that lets you see galaxies billions of light years away, but somehow it's designed so you can't look through it at the room you're sitting in. The tone is definitely ironic, almost comical, but there's a certain benign quality to it. It's optimistic, sure, but heavily qualified, almost self-defeating in its own way. And guess what? This whole framework wasn't just abstract theorizing. It directly mirrored Crochet's reaction to post-World War I Europe. In his History of Europe in the 19th century, he added an epilogue acknowledging something deeply unsettling. After the war, it seemed like all the nasty stuff, violence, sadism, irrationalism, materialism, egotism, had actually gotten stronger, not weaker. Even the pessimists who'd been whispering about decline before the war were now shouting it from the rooftops, predicting the collapse of Western civilization, maybe even humanity itself. Croce called this grim reality a fact. Denying it or trying to pin it down to just one group or country was pointless. But here's the twist. Precisely because it was a fact, it offered an opportunity for hope. As a fact, it had to play a role in the ongoing development of the spirit, perhaps as raw material for strengthening existing values. But, and this is key, we couldn't judge it properly. Its true function, its ultimate meaning, could only be understood by some future historian looking back at its end. We, caught in the thick of it, are simply blind to its larger significance. So, if we're fundamentally unable to judge our own age, what's the point? Croce argues that it doesn't matter. What matters is participation. Don't waste energy contemplating what cannot be contemplated. Instead, act according to the role conscience assigns and duty commands. Basically, do your job, follow your moral compass, and keep moving. He explicitly forbade judgment only on those old 19th century myths, activism, communism, transcendentalism, chauvinism that his philosophy had already declared transcended. But the resurgence of irrationalism in the 1920s? That wasn't necessarily bad. He saw it as a sign of underlying energy, a will to a future, and thus another occasion for action, specifically for promoting liberty. So, his advice echoes his earlier work. Suspend judgment on the whole picture, but engage practically with the daily aspects of the world around you. Deal with the problems as they come, without trying to grasp the entire unknowable trajectory. Croce stresses this isn't prophecy. Prophecy is vain, forbidden territory. What he's offering isn't a command, but a suggestion. If you agree with his interpretation of the past, based on your own moral sense and observations, then here's a path. But others, guided by different ideals, would see the situation differently and act accordingly. And that's okay. Whatever path they choose, as long as they act with a pure mind, driven by an inner command, they too will be preparing the future well. There's a strong ethical undertone here. A liberal history, he suggests, can't afford to absolutely condemn those who disagree. It can lay out a path for its followers. Work according to this line every day, every hour, and trust in divine providence. It's almost like invoking a religious framework, calling it a religion of liberty, where faith in a higher providence guides practical action, even amidst uncertainty. Of course, this stance didn't sit well with everyone. Liberals, radicals, even conservatives criticized him. Their beef was his moral ambiguity, especially regarding the rise of fascism. He resisted fascism personally, but could he condemn it unequivocally on principle? His critics argued no. If this supposedly advanced historical consciousness couldn't judge the present, couldn't distinguish right from wrong in real time, except perhaps by appealing to timeless truths or past lessons, then who decides what to do? Who gets to fault the new forces shaping the world? Where did the moral clarity and optimism of the pre-war Croce go? It vanished. The critics missed the crucial point Croce made earlier. His philosophy acknowledged the limits of historical knowledge when it came to judging the present moment. His self-conscious historical approach was precisely designed to avoid making definitive pronouncements on the unfolding now. To understand this better, we need to look at Croce's concept of the four moments of spirit. Besides the good, the true, and the beautiful, there's a fourth, the practical. This, he claimed, was his most original contribution. Now when it comes to actually living our lives, Croce argued, we don't get guidance from art, philosophy, history, or science. Nope. Our decisions are governed by our gut feeling about what's practical or impractical. Art gives us the world as vivid perceptions organized into forms. Science helps us understand cause and effect to get things done. Philosophy sharpens our critical thinking for intellectual pursuits. And history? History lets us look back at what people tried before, providing material to think about human thought and action across time and space, allowing us to generalize about the nature of consciousness or spirit in conceptual terms. But none of them tell us what to do right now. Because history operates on this level of the particular, Croce insisted it couldn't provide direction for action. Why? Because history as knowledge deals only with specifics, never with universals, and not even reliably with general trends. Think about it. When historians try to generalize from historical facts using statistics or abstractions, they're actually doing something else entirely, pseudoscientific reflection, according to Croce. The authority behind such generalizations isn't historical, it's sociological. Similarly, if you try to force historical data into grand philosophical schemas like Hegel or Comte did, seeking a universal content, you're again appealing to non-historical, specifically philosophical authority. Croce's core claim: you simply cannot conceptualize history in the way philosophers try to do, nor can you genuinely generalize from it. Historical knowledge is just knowledge of specific events, elevated to the status of knowledge by the historian's narrative structure. It's a blend of philosophical concepts and artistic intuition of particulars. So, what is a historical account fundamentally? Croce sees it as nothing more than a series of statements about what happened, linked together into a story. It identifies events and represents how they unfolded. This makes history a special kind of art. Unlike pure art, which plays with possibility and impossibility, the historian adds the dimension of real versus unreal. But even here, the historian's power is strictly limited. He can only assert what did happen or didn't happen. He can never speculate on what might have happened if circumstances were different, and definitely not predict what might happen in the future based on the past. Grammatically, he's restricted to the simple past tense and declarative mood. No present tense, no subjunctive mood. Interestingly, he argues that poetry and history share the same method, the basic syntactical rules of everyday language. It's all about telling a coherent story using familiar grammar. What are the big consequences of this view? Huge ones. It fundamentally challenges the idea that history can be used to illuminate the present or guide future action. Forget Hegel using history as a mediator between conflicting interests. Forget Marx using it to reveal the true nature of society to choose the right program. Forget Nietzsche using it to construct a world vision for the will to power. For Croce, history teaches nothing in that sense. Its only legitimate function is to inform us about the past. It can give us insights into what was vital or moribund in previous ages, but it's completely silent about what's alive or dead in our own. People might have their own ideas about what's creative or destructive today, based on their beliefs, but they can't find justification for their actions in the pages of history books. History is past tense, period. So, if history can't guide us, where does our sense of what's important in the present come from? Croce argues it stems from our current interests, problems, concerns. In fact, all interest in the past is ultimately a function of present concerns. We study history because we have questions about now. But here's the rub: letting these present concerns dictate how we write history inevitably leads to errors. The historian can start with a question from the present, but they cannot then use the historical findings to draw general conclusions or derive implications for the present. The only conclusion possible is ironically that history is neither a perfect idyll nor a pure tragedy of horrors, but just a messy drama involving ordinary, middling characters doing ordinary, mixed-up things. It's a profoundly anti-heroic, anti-dramatic view of history's purpose. Croce pushes this further. Not only can history not distinguish good from evil facts, or progressive from regressive epochs, he says history doesn't even begin until we stop making those judgments. History starts when we ask, what function did this previously condemned fact or epoch actually fulfill? What did it produce? Since everything in its own way is productive, the conclusion is radical. Nothing should be condemned by history. Everything deserves praise and veneration. By essentially aestheticizing history, judging it by its inherent qualities rather than its moral outcomes, Croce effectively de-ethicizes it. He thought he was elevating it to a higher plane, beyond good and evil, achieving permanent de-ideologization. But critics saw it as morally neutral, perhaps even agnostic. Later thinkers, looking back at the rise of totalitarian regimes, often interpreted Croce's stance as either morally weak or a strategic ploy to undermine Marxist historical claims. From our perspective, it seems plausible. But we need to remember Croce's stated goal at the time: to strip history of the authority claimed by everyone, left and right, and return it to being a secondary form of cognition, important but not foundational. This served the interests of established groups wary of any analysis that might challenge their status quo. By disengaging history from politics, science, traditional philosophy, and religion, and returning it to the realm of art, Croce aimed to domesticate it, making it less threatening in ideological battles. But this required a very specific kind of art, one stripped of the Dionysiac, the passionate, the disruptive impulses Nietzsche valued. It needed an aesthetics incapable of recognizing much modern art and literature as genuine art. This domestication came at a price. To make historical thinking seem innocent and reverent towards the past, Croce forced historians to adopt an extreme irony towards their own present. Many followers mistakenly saw this as pure relativism, artistic insights leading to philosophical conclusions, so anything goes. But Croce's goal was the opposite: to redefine artistic insight as the very foundation for knowing the real world. This explains his intense hostility towards Burckhardt, whom he condemned more harshly than Ranke. Burckhardt erred not in seeing history as art, but in defining art wrongly as mere play or escape. Croce's original target, in a way, was Nietzsche for misunderstanding art as fantasy or intoxication, thereby betraying the real connection between artistic sensibility and knowledge. How did Croce systematically critique other historians and philosophers of history? His method was quite specific. He'd isolate the different modes of thinking at play in their work: the synecdochic or typological, the metonymic or causal, and the metaphorical or poetic. Then he'd figure out how these modes shaped the narrative's form and content. He'd label these modes as the reasons why the historian strayed from his proper job, telling stories of concrete facts guided by common sense and his own philosophy. Finally, he'd apply his living versus dead distinction to evaluate the thinker's work. This epistemological principle became his tool for spotting errors. The historian, he argued, could use the historical process, but only as if it were an ironic comedy. Always highlight what was living, growing, persisting, even in tough times. Show that life persists even in death, but emphasize the life aspect, because history is fundamentally about life, not death. This ironic element comes from the fact that life inherently involves death. Everything born must die. But death isn't tragic, it's just a fact of life, an occasion for preservation. However, the historian shouldn't get carried away celebrating life itself. No real resolutions to social conflicts, please. Croce deliberately avoided starting or ending his major histories with epochal events, those fixed points in time. His histories are all about transition, low-key, gradual, mimicking everyday life without dramatic beginnings or endings. Take his history of Europe in the 19th century. It starts after Napoleon's fall in the drab Restoration period and ends before one in the equally drab Edwardian age. The point? To dismantle any sense of a grand teleological arc like romance, comedy, or tragedy. It's about elevating the mundane, the everyday, against the backdrop of grandiose myths or intellectual abstractions. If the liberal age seemed boring or prosaic, Croce argued, it was only because intellectuals failed to appreciate the quiet achievements of ordinary people doing their daily jobs. The prevalence of false ideals and irrationalism stemmed partly from intellectuals failing to connect with the practical carriers of the age. These problems could have been solved by criticism and education, or simply faded away, if not for imperialist rivalries fanning the flames. So, World War I wasn't some epochal turning point. It was the result of a general moral malaise combined with an irrational will to power. It wasn't tragic, it was pathetic. Croce viewed it like the preceding century, with the pathos of irony, a kind of compassionate, detached sadness. And like the age before it, the war itself was another occasion for creative endeavor, demanding both qualified reverence and qualified criticism from the historian. Now let's look at how Croce tackled Marx. This happened later, after 1895, heavily influenced by his former teacher, Antonio Labriola, who had shifted from Herbartianism to championing dialectical materialism and socialism. Croce claimed he gave Marx a fair hearing. But intellectually, it was already a foregone conclusion. Given Croce's established view of history as art and individuality, Marx's project of creating laws of historical development was fundamentally alien. Still, the encounter is revealing. It shows how Croce's critical strategy worked, and hints at the psychological strain of rejecting Labriola, his former master, even as he repudiated Marxism. Croce's initial reaction to Marx was scathing, doubly fallacious. First, because it was materialistic, focusing on base economics instead of the spirit. Second, because it still operated under a predetermined design, basically a variation on Hegel's flawed philosophy of history. Okay, he conceded. Marx's focus on economics was useful, reminding academics about the lives of ordinary people. But ultimately, Marxism failed as a philosophy of history and as a philosophy overall. It was just a recommendation for historians to pay attention to economic activity and the ideas swirling around it. Nothing more, nothing less. A tool for empirical interpretation, not a grand theory of everything. Labriola fired back, accusing Croce of being an ivory tower intellectual, indifferent to real struggles, just writing to escape boredom and stuck in formal prejudice. Croce responded by diving back into Marx's work, emerging with an even harsher verdict. As an economist, Marx was interesting mainly for historical data about workers and owners. His surplus value theory, just a sloppy comparison between an abstract ideal society and actual capitalism. As a philosopher or scientist, neither. At best, maybe an arrogant political talent or revolutionary genius who created a doctrine tailored for the workers' movement. Croce even claimed Marx himself provided the clearest examples of pseudoscience and ideology. Ultimately, Marx was just a new prophet, preaching a destructive gospel that threatened the very ideality of human life. Labriola retorted that Croce was just being biased, interested in using bits of Marxism for socialism, not understanding it. Croce retreated to his philosophical high ground. Okay, he said, Labriola wants to use Marxism for political ends. My job is to determine what's living and what's dead in it from a purely theoretical standpoint. The only living part? A reminder for historians to consider economics. The dead parts? The economic theory of exploitation and the philosophical justification for revolution. The later debates within Marxism, like the revisionist dispute, proved its philosophical weakness, Croce argued. When sophisticated critics like Sorel, Bernstein, and himself examined it, its authority crumbled. His tactic was brilliant. Grant Marxism minimal relevance to history, appear open-minded, while simultaneously excising its radical core. It was a form of castration by historicization, treating potentially dangerous ideas as already safely confined to the past. Looking back, Croce's rejection of Marxism seems almost inevitable given his background and his view of history as art. But his encounter with Hegel is trickier. Croce was always an idealist, though he called himself realistic, meaning he rejected any separate realm of abstract essences. So what was his realistic idealism? He spelled it out in 1906. For Croce, Hegel was the philosopher par excellence. But Hegel made a fatal mistake. He treated philosophical concepts universals as tools for interpreting history. Philosophy, Croce insisted, deals only with concepts and their relationships via logic. Its generalizations stay in the conceptual realm. Trying to apply them to historical events, like Marx tried with economics, was just as wrong. Both were attempting to universalize inappropriately. Despite this, Croce gave Hegel credit. Hegel opened the door to modern, historically aware humanism. He was fundamentally opposed to any view of reality outside or beneath the world. He saw through simplistic solutions to the mind-matter problem. Hegel realized the world itself, in its concreteness, was the object of thought. He even managed to hold both unity and opposition as valid perspectives on the same evolving reality. The world is both one and internally differentiated. This internal difference allows for change, making the world a becoming, a history. Hegel captured this in his triad: being, nothingness, and becoming synthesis. This was Hegel's glory, the logic of reality. But it was also his burden, because applying this rigid three-step formula mechanically to nature and history led to those false totalizing systems Croce despised. Croce believed Hegel's interpreters consistently messed up. They missed the tragic optimistic edge. They wrongly saw Hegel as conservative. They failed to grasp he was actually a historicist, not an idealist in the traditional sense. Only Vico came close. The core error, Croce argued, was applying the philosophical insight about reality being one yet differentiated directly to historical events. On the plus side, this made every historical fact sacred, worthy of study, fostering genuine historical empathy. But the minus side was applying the thesis-antithesis-synthesis model to analyze the complex web of actual historical facts, generating all sorts of flawed philosophies. To truly salvage Hegel, you couldn't just separate the philosopher from the historian. The error was deeper, philosophical. You needed Croce's method of distinzione discrimination. What is this method of distinzione? It's about recognizing that while concepts like good and evil can be opposed, things in the world can only be distinguished. This doesn't deny the underlying unity, but insists we need different ways of talking about concepts versus things. Don't confuse spiritual activity with specific art, morality, or utility. Look at life. We naturally distinguish different spheres: economic, scientific, moral, artistic, and different roles: poet, worker, statesman. Even philosophy isn't a monolith, it's aesthetics, ethics, logic, etc. The historical process is a nexus and rhythm of these distinct entities. Bad classification chops reality up like cutting a cake with a knife, destroying unity. The right way, which Croce credits to Hegel, is the schema of degrees. Lower levels are implicated in higher ones, uniting things without forcing them into indifferent categories. This allowed Hegel to connect diverse fields, but Croce warns against confusing this with the logic of opposites. Croce argues different aspects of experience require different conceptual tools. Truth isn't related to falsehood the same way it's related to goodness. Life and death are illusions resolved into life. Truth and goodness are distinct yet united in a hierarchy of reality. This leads to his organismic holism. An organism struggles against death, but its parts hand, foot aren't fighting each other. Similarly, spirit is development, history, being and non-being together becoming. But the spirit as studied by philosophy is eternal, ideal history, the timeless cycle of birth and death, never actually born or dying. Forget this distinction, and you're doomed to error. But Hegel forgot this crucial distinction between opposites and distinctions. He took the schema of degrees and forced it into the mold of dialectical opposites, applying the thesis-antithesis-synthesis model to areas where it didn't fit. He treated the theory of distinctions and the theory of opposites as if they were the same thing. The result? He tried to cram the rich, complex data of philosophy, art, nature, and history into that simplistic three-step box. Croce even wrote a chapter titled The Metamorphosis of Errors, detailing how Hegel distorted these fields by doing so. Croce's critique of Hegel's philosophy of history hinges on this. Hegel failed to see art's autonomy, and therefore failed to see history's autonomy. History, unlike art, needs philosophy as its foundation, but like art, it gets its raw material through intuition, perception of individual facts. Therefore, history is always narration, storytelling, never a closed system of theory, even if it rests on theoretical principles. Historiography can be rigorous in gathering facts, but it remains an art in its telling. The core of a historical judgment is something happened, combining an intuitive element, the subject, Caesar, Rome, with logical predicates, murder, devastation. History could yield a purely empirical science, sociology, but not a substitute for philosophy. Conversely, philosophy can't derive history from particulars. You either do philosophy or you do history. A philosophy of history is a contradiction. Hegel's attempt to merge them destroyed the possibility of genuine historical writing. Ultimately, Croce argued, Hegel couldn't escape the dualism he fought. To unite spirit and nature, he invented logos, universal reason, as a third entity. But this logos was just an abstraction imposed on concrete reality, leaving no room for the irrational. Hegelianism remained a muddled mix of mind and matter philosophy. Nature has a clear content physics, math, spirit has a clear content psychology, law, art, religion, but logos, empty abstraction. To give logos substance, Hegel equated it with history. But history isn't just reason, it's reason and unreason interacting. History constantly undermines philosophical generalizations because it reveals new complexities. The historian uses general ideas, but combining them with facts is an intuitive, artistic act giving form to chaos, constantly checking imagination against evidence. So, what was living and what was dead in Hegelianism? Croce's answer aimed to consolidate resistance against any attempt to force history into neat universal molds. Preserve Hegel's insights, the total reality as the philosophical object, the dialectic as a tool for concepts, the idea of degrees allowing autonomy within unity. But reject panlogism, any attempt to make reality fit abstract reason, and any dialectical reading of history. Affirm reason's role in philosophy, but deny its authority to dictate the meaning of history. Protect history from being twisted by imagination, generalization, or philosophy. Historical judgment combines philosophical concepts and empirical facts, discerned through artistic intuition and philosophical reflection, unified by the specific act of the historian stating this happened at that time and place. That's the Crocian legacy on history.